Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Boston, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1873, and Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood represented the pinnacle of refinement and respectability. Among its distinguished residents was Edward Montgomery Blackwood, a gentleman of considerable wealth who had arrived from London 3 years prior. At 42 years of age, Blackwood presented an impressive figure, impeccably dressed, articulate, and possessed of the cultured manners that quickly established him within Boston's elite social circles. He purchased an elegant brownstone on Mount Vernon Street, employed a small but efficient household staff, and positioned himself as a private investor with connections to several prominent banking institutions. Those who encountered Blackwood at social gatherings or charitable events invariably described him as the very model of Victorian propriety. He attended Sunday services at King's Chapel with unfailing regularity, made generous donations to Massachusetts General Hospital, and hosted occasional dinner parties noted for their excellent cuisine and stimulating conversation. The Boston Evening Transcript once featured him in an article about European investors who had chosen to make Boston their home, praising his discerning taste and commitment to civic improvement. What remained hidden from Blackwood's social acquaintances was his peculiar pattern of solitary behavior. According to household records discovered decades later, he frequently dismissed his staff for days at a time, citing a need for complete solitude to attend to private business matters. During these periods of isolation, Blackwood was observed making late-night visits to Boston's waterfront district, far from the respectable confines of Beacon Hill. A dockworker's journal, discovered in 1962 during the renovation of an old harbormaster's office, noted the presence of a well-dressed gentleman who seems oddly out of place on numerous occasions throughout 1872 and early 1873. The dockworker, identified only as J. Sullivan in his journal, wrote on January 18, 1873, "The gentleman in the fine coat came again tonight, walking slowly along the pier as if searching for something specific. When I approached to offer assistance, he startled violently before composing himself with remarkable speed. He inquired about incoming ships from South America and seemed particularly interested in vessels carrying medical or scientific specimens. He offered me a silver dollar to notify him of any such arrivals, an arrangement I accepted, though something in his manner left me unsettled." This journal, largely overlooked until historian Margaret Caldwell discovered it while researching Boston's maritime history, provides one of the few contemporaneous observations of Blackwood's activities outside his Beacon Hill persona. Sullivan's subsequent entries document at least 7 more encounters with Blackwood between January and April 1873, noting that the gentleman sometimes carried a small black medical bag and on 2 occasions was seen conversing intently with sailors from recently docked vessels. Perhaps most telling was Blackwood's dining habits. His cook, Margaret Sullivan, no relation to the dockworker, later testified that her employer insisted on preparing certain meals himself, having a separate pantry installed adjacent to his study for this purpose. He was most particular about his private dining, Sullivan stated in a deposition preserved in the Suffolk County Archives. He would order the finest cuts of meat from the butcher on Charles Street, but insisted they be delivered directly to him, not through the kitchen, as was customary. I never saw these packages, nor did I ever clean the dishes from these private meals. Sullivan's testimony, given to investigators in June 1873, further revealed that Blackwood maintained a separate set of silverware and china that no one but himself was permitted to touch. These items were kept locked in a cabinet in his study, she reported. Once, when I inadvertently entered, while he was unlocking this cabinet, he became uncharacteristically agitated, dismissing me from the room with a sharpness I had never before witnessed in his manner. The butcher who supplied Blackwood's special orders, Thomas Harrington, provided additional insights in a newspaper interview published in the Boston Globe on June 8, 1873. Mr. Tarr. Blackwood was very specific about his requirements, Harrington recalled. He requested meats that were unusual even for the most sophisticated palates. Organ meats primarily, and always extremely fresh. He paid handsomely for discretion and special handling. I assumed he was indulging in European delicacies that might seem strange to American sensibilities. The first indication that something was amiss came in February of 1873, when a local physician, Dr. James Hullbrook, was called to Blackwood's residence to treat what was described as a digestive ailment. According to Dr. Hullbrook's medical journal, recovered during a 1958 academic study of 19th century medical practices, Blackwood exhibited symptoms consistent with food poisoning, but refused to allow the doctor to examine the contents of his private pantry. The doctor noted that Blackwood's study contained an unusual apparatus that appeared to be for the purpose of cooking, or perhaps distilling, though its exact function was not clear to me. Dr. Hullbrook's journal entry, dated February 12, 1873, offers a rare glimpse into Blackwood's private domain. Upon entering Mr. Blackwood's study to examine him, I was struck by several unusual features of the room. Beyond the expected bookshelves and writing desk, I observed what appeared to be laboratory equipment more suited to a medical facility than a private residence. A glass distillation apparatus occupied one corner, alongside several sealed containers of a design unfamiliar to me. Most curious was a small stove of unusual construction, apparently designed to maintain precise temperatures. When I inquired about these items, Mr. Blackwood explained that he pursued amateur scientific investigations, particularly in chemistry and biology, as a means of exercising the mind. His manner when discussing these matters was cordial yet guarded, and he deftly steered our conversation back to his immediate symptoms. The doctor's account continues with a detailed description of Blackwood's physical condition. The patient presented with acute abdominal distress, vomiting, and mild fever, consistent with consumption of tainted food. However, certain aspects of his condition were atypical. His pupils were unusually dilated, and he exhibited periodic tremors in his extremities that he attributed to the pain, but which I suspect may have another cause entirely. Most concerning was a peculiar odor on his breath, not the expected smell of vomitus, but something more acrid and unfamiliar, reminiscent of certain chemical compounds. When I suggested that knowledge of what he had recently consumed might assist my diagnosis, he became notably evasive, insisting that his ailment must be due to the damp Boston climate affecting his constitution. By spring of that year, several residents in the North End district had vanished, without explanation. While disappearances were not uncommon in the poorer sections of Boston during this period, what struck authorities as unusual was the specific demographic of the missing individuals. They were not the typical cases of runaway youth or transient laborers, but rather respected tradespeople, a tailor, a bookbinder, a watchmaker, individuals with established businesses and community ties who seemingly had no reason to abandon their lives. The first to disappear was Anton Müller, a German immigrant who had established a successful watchmaking business on Hanover Street. Müller, 53, was last seen closing his shop on the evening of January 24, 1873. His apprentice, arriving the next morning to find the shop still locked, reported his absence to authorities. Muller's ledger, examined by police, showed an appointment with an unnamed gentleman client from Beacon Hill, scheduled for the evening of his disappearance. 3 weeks later, on February 17th, Samuel Goldstein, a tailor with a small but prosperous establishment catering to middle-class customers, similarly vanished. Goldstein, 47, had told his wife he was meeting a new client who had requested a late appointment to be fitted for formal attire. The client, described only as an Englishman of refined manners, had apparently offered to pay double the usual rate for the inconvenience of the late hour. The third disappearance occurred on March 8th, when Elizabeth Murray, a bookbinder known for her skill in repairing valuable volumes for collectors and institutions, failed to return home from her workshop. Murray, an unmarried woman of 38, lived with her elderly mother, who reported that her daughter had mentioned an exciting commission from a private collector shortly before her disappearance. A neighbor later recalled seeing Murray speaking with a well-dressed gentleman near her workshop on the afternoon she vanished. According to police records examined by historian Eleanor Prescott in her 1964 study, Crime in Victorian Boston, the authorities initially paid little attention to these disappearances, dismissing them as unrelated incidents. It was only when Thomas Walsh, a prominent butcher from Hanover Street, vanished in April 1873 that a formal investigation was launched. Walsh was last seen closing his shop on a Tuesday evening, reportedly telling his apprentice that he had an appointment with a distinguished client from Beacon Hill. The police investigation, led by Detective Michael O'Malley of Boston's recently formed Detective Division, initially focused on possible connections between the victims. A review of the case notes, preserved in the Boston Police Historical Society archives, reveals that O'Malley recognized certain patterns. All four missing individuals were skilled professionals. All had apparently arranged meetings with clients shortly before their disappearances, and in 3 cases, those clients were described as well-dressed gentlemen, possibly of English origin. O'Malley's investigation led him to interview several residents of Beacon Hill, seeking information about any English gentlemen in the area who might have had contact with the missing persons. According to his case diary, he spoke with Edward Blackwood on April 27, 1873, but found nothing immediately suspicious. "Mr. Blackwood received me cordially in his study," O'Malley wrote. He expressed appropriate concern about the disappearances, but denied any knowledge of the missing individuals. He volunteered information about his recent arrival from London and his business activities in Boston, apparently anticipating that his foreign origin might raise questions. I noted nothing unusual in his demeanor or residence, though he seemed eager to conclude our interview, citing pressing business correspondence. What connects these disappearances to Edward Blackwood might have remained forever obscured had it not been for the unusually warm May of 1873. According to meteorological records kept by Harvard University, temperatures rose significantly above normal for nearly 2 weeks. It was during this heat wave that residents near Blackwood's home began to notice an unpleasant odor emanating from the property. Initially dismissed as perhaps a dead animal trapped in a wall or chimney, the smell persisted despite Blackwood's assurances to neighbors that he had thoroughly searched the premises. Henrietta Lowell, who lived in the adjacent townhouse, recorded her concerns in a letter to her sister, dated May 14, 1873. "The odor from the Blackwood residence has become nearly unbearable in this heat. It is not the usual smell of decay one might associate with a dead rat or squirrel, but something far more pungent and, I must say, sickening. Mr. Blackwood has been most apologetic, even going so far as to hire men to investigate the chimney and walls, though they apparently found nothing. He has taken to burning copious amounts of incense and keeping his windows shut tight despite the heat, which strikes me as odd. Frederick, her husband, says I am being unnecessarily concerned, but something about the situation unsettles me deeply." On May 17, 1873, Officer Patrick Donnelly was conducting his regular patrol of Mount Vernon Street when he observed an unusual amount of large flies gathered at a basement window of Blackwood's home. This detail, recorded in his daily report to the precinct captain, might have been overlooked had it not been for a subsequent incident that same evening. According to witness statements collected later, Edward Blackwood was seen struggling to move a large trunk into a carriage late at night. When approached by a concerned neighbor, Blackwood appeared unusually disheveled and agitated, claiming he was sending some old belongings to a relative in New York. Frederick Lowell, Henrietta's husband, and the neighbor who spoke with Blackwood that evening, provided a detailed account of the encounter, during the subsequent investigation. I was returning home from my club at approximately 11 o'clock when I observed Mr. Blackwood attempting to load a large trunk into a waiting carriage. What struck me as unusual was both the hour and his appearance. His typically immaculate attire was disheveled, his collar askew, and he was perspiring profusely despite the cooler evening air. When I offered my assistance, he startled violently, as if unaware of my approach, and declined with uncharacteristic abruptness. When I inquired casually about his travel plans, he explained that he was not traveling himself, but sending some family heirlooms to his cousin in New York. What troubled me most was the trunk itself. It appeared quite heavy, requiring significant effort on his part to move, and I detected a faint odor emanating from it, similar to the smell that had been troubling our homes. Most disturbing of all, I could have sworn I saw what appeared to be a dark liquid seeping from one corner of the trunk, though the poor lighting made it difficult to be certain. The following morning, Officer Donnelly, having heard about the incident with the trunk, decided to make inquiries at Blackwood's residence. When no one answered his repeated knocks, Donnelly consulted with his superior, who authorized him to enter the premises based on concerns about the persistent odor and Blackwood's unusual behavior. Officer Donnelly's initial entry into the Blackwood residence is documented in his official report, filed later that day. Upon receiving no response to repeated knocking, and observing that the front door was uncharacteristically unlocked, I entered the premises at approximately 9:15 a.m. The interior of the main floor appeared orderly, though I noted an unusually strong scent of incense and chemical agents, apparently intended to mask another underlying odor. Proceeding through the rooms, I found no sign of Mr. Blackwood or his staff. A partially packed valise in the master bedroom suggested hasty preparations for departure. My attention was drawn to a heavy door leading to the basement area, which was secured with an unusual lock of foreign manufacture. Given the circumstances and the increasingly powerful odor emanating from below, I felt justified in forcing this lock to continue my investigation. What Officer Donnelly discovered upon entering the basement area of Blackwood's home defied explanation at first, later described in his official report as a scene beyond the comprehension of any decent mind. The basement had been converted into what appeared to be a combination of kitchen and laboratory. Large tables lined with unusual instruments, specimen jars containing what looked to be preserved organs, and several leather-bound journals filled with meticulous handwritten notes occupied the space. Donnelly's report continues, "The basement had been extensively modified from its original purpose. The central area contained a large table of heavy construction, equipped with drainage channels leading to collection vessels. Surrounding this central feature were shelving units holding glass containers of various sizes, many containing preserved specimens of what appeared to be human origin. A separate area had been configured as a kitchen of sorts, with specialized cooking apparatus including a modified oven capable of precise temperature control, and several custom-designed cutting and processing tools of exceptional quality and unusual design. Most disturbing was a hidden chamber accessed through a false wall, where Officer Donnelly discovered human remains in various states of preparation. I'll refrain from providing specific details, but suffice it to say that Edward Blackwood's private dining habits now took on a horrifying new context. The journals found in the basement revealed a methodical approach to what Blackwood referred to as his culinary explorations, detailing his selection criteria for ingredients and his techniques for preparation. Donnelly immediately reported his findings to police headquarters, and within hours, the Blackwood residence had been secured as a crime scene. Detective O'Malley, who had interviewed Blackwood just weeks earlier, took charge of the investigation, assisted by Dr. William Hammond, a medical examiner with the city of Boston. Dr. Hammond's preliminary report, dated May 19, 1873, provides a clinical assessment of the scene. The human remains discovered in the hidden chamber appear to belong to at least 4 individuals, though precise determination is complicated by the condition and arrangement of the specimens. Based on preliminary examination, these individuals appear to have died within the past 3 to 4 months, consistent with the timeline of the recent disappearances. Most significant is the selective nature of the remains. Certain organs and tissues have been carefully extracted and preserved separately, while others have been discarded or processed in a manner suggesting consumption. According to the journals, Blackwood's macabre practices had begun years earlier in London, where he had apparently evaded detection during a series of similar disappearances in the Whitechapel area. He had fled to America when he feared the authorities were closing in, establishing himself in Boston to continue what he described as his necessary consumption. One journal entry dated September 14, 1870, and quoted in Detective O'Malley's final report reads, "The incident with Inspector Michaels has convinced me that London has become untenable. While I believe I have left no evidence that could directly implicate me, his questions regarding my interest in the disappearances suggest that someone has made a connection I had thought impossible. America offers promising possibilities. Boston, with its combination of sophisticated society and proximity to excellent medical institutions, seems ideal. The journey will necessitate a hiatus in my essential activities, but I have prepared several preserved specimens that should sustain me during the interim." Perhaps most chilling was Blackwood's apparent belief that by consuming certain individuals, particularly those he deemed to possess exceptional skills or intelligence, he could absorb their qualities. His writings revealed a disturbing philosophy that blended aspects of ancient tribal practices with a twisted interpretation of evolutionary theory that was gaining popularity at that time. He referred to himself as an evolutionary pioneer and the next advancement of the human species. A journal entry from March 1873 elaborates on this belief system. "Muller's precision has manifested in my own work. I find myself capable of movements with my instruments that previously exceeded my dexterity." The integration was initially uncomfortable, causing tremors and disorientation, but as his essence has been fully incorporated, these symptoms have resolved into a remarkable enhancement. Goldstein's aesthetic sensibilities have similarly been absorbed, though I find the process less predictable with creative rather than technical abilities. The female bookbinder's contribution was unexpected. Her meticulous attention to detail has refined my own observational capacities beyond what I anticipated. I have begun to perceive patterns and connections previously invisible to me. Each incorporation brings me closer to transcendence, to evolving beyond the limitations of the single, isolated human consciousness into something far more expansive and profound. Edward Montgomery Blackwood was nowhere to be found when authorities searched his home. The trunk that neighbors had observed him loading into a carriage the previous night was never located, and no record exists of him boarding any trains or ships departing from Boston during that period. A city-wide manhunt ensued, with Blackwood's photograph published in newspapers throughout the Northeast. Police reports indicate that several sightings were reported in the weeks that followed, but none could be confirmed. The investigation expanded rapidly as the horrifying details of Blackwood's activities became apparent. Telegrams were sent to police departments across the country and to Scotland Yard in London, sharing Blackwood's description and the nature of his crimes. According to correspondence preserved in police archives, the London authorities responded with information about several unsolved disappearances in the Mayfair and Whitechapel areas between 1868 and 1870 that matched Blackwood's methodology. Detective Inspector James Michaels of Scotland Yard, the officer mentioned in Blackwood's journal, arrived in Boston in June 1873 to assist with the investigation. His official report to his superiors, later published in part in the Journal of Criminal Law and Police Science, 1962, reveals that he had indeed been investigating Blackwood in London. My suspicions regarding Mr. Blackwood were aroused by certain patterns in the disappearances, specifically the selection of victims with specialized skills and the absence of any obvious motive such as robbery or ransom. During an interview at his Mayfair residence in August 1870, I observed several unusual features of his home, including specialized equipment, similar to that later discovered in his Boston residence. While I had no evidence sufficient to justify a search or arrest at that time, I placed him under discreet surveillance. His abrupt departure from London in October 1870 occurred the day after he became aware of this surveillance, confirming my suspicions, but leaving me without recourse to pursue the matter further. The summer of 1873 passed with no sign of Edward Blackwood. The case captivated Boston citizens, with newspapers publishing lurid accounts of the Beacon Hill Horror or the Gentleman Ghoul, as Blackwood came to be known. According to library archives, sales of personal firearms increased dramatically during this period, and many families hired additional household security. The social fabric of Boston's elite circles was particularly affected, as many had welcomed Blackwood into their homes and broken bread with him at their tables. The psychological impact on Boston's upper-class society was profound. Diaries and letters from this period reveal a community struggling with the realization that they had embraced a monster. Elizabeth Cabot Lowell, a prominent socialite who had hosted Blackwood at several dinner parties, wrote in her journal on June 4, 1873, "We have all become suspicious of one another. At the Appletons' gathering last evening, conversation repeatedly returned to Blackwood despite attempts to avoid the subject. Every peculiarity of behavior or dietary preference among our acquaintances now seems potentially sinister. Harrison, her husband, insists that we employ a food taster before serving any meal with guests present. He presents this as a jest, but I detect genuine anxiety beneath his humor. The foundations of our social intercourse, trust, hospitality, the breaking of bread together, have been poisoned by this man's depravity." In August of that year, a partial development occurred when a groundskeeper at Mount Auburn Cemetery reported discovering signs of recent digging at several graves. Police investigated and found evidence consistent with Blackwood's methods, suggesting he may have been hiding in the Cambridge area. A night watch was established, but the perpetrator, presumed to be Blackwood, was never apprehended. The cemetery incident is detailed in reports filed by Officer Thomas Kelly, who led the investigation of the disturbed graves. A total of 7 burial sites showed evidence of tampering, all dating from the previous week, based on groundskeeper Williams's observations of the grounds. In each case, the earth had been carefully removed and subsequently replaced in a manner attempting to conceal the disturbance. Examination of the coffins revealed that small openings had been created, sufficient to extract specific organs, primarily the brain and liver. The precision of the incisions and the selective nature of the removal are consistent with the methodologies documented in Blackwood's journals. Most telling was the discovery of a surgical instrument of unusual design, apparently dropped inadvertently at one of the sites, which matches the description of custom tools found in Blackwood's Boston laboratory. By autumn, the case had grown cold. Public interest waned as no new developments emerged, though many Bostonians continued to lock their doors with extra care. The brownstone on Mount Vernon Street remained vacant, as no buyer was willing to purchase a property with such a gruesome history. Eventually, the city seized the property for back taxes, and it was demolished in 1890 to make way for a small park that exists to this day, though few modern visitors realize its dark origins. The last confirmed documentation relating to Edward Montgomery Blackwood dates to October 1873, when a patient matching his description was briefly admitted to Bellevue Hospital in New York City, suffering from what doctors diagnosed as acute digestive distress. According to hospital records uncovered during a 1967 academic study of 19th century medical cases, the patient, who gave his name as Edward Montgomery, escaped from the facility after 2 days, stealing a doctor's coat, and identification papers. The Bellevue Hospital admission record, dated October 12, 1873, contains this clinical description: patient presence with severe abdominal pain, intermittent vomiting, and fever of 101 degrees Celsius. Notable symptoms include unusual pupillary dilation, muscular tremors, and periodic disorientation. Patient attributes symptoms to food poisoning from tainted oysters, but becomes agitated when questioned about his recent meals or activities. Physical examination revealed unusual scarring on the inner arms and hands, possibly consistent with chemical or heat burns. Patient refused further examination and became hostile when blood samples were suggested. Preliminary diagnosis: possible ergot poisoning or exposure to unknown toxic substance. Recommended treatment: intestinal lavage, monitored hydration, and further toxicological investigation. A subsequent note added on October 14th states simply, "Patient missing from ward as of morning rounds. Attendant reports medical coat and identification papers belonging to Dr. Harrison also missing. Authorities notified." For decades, the case faded into obscurity, becoming little more than a macabre footnote in Boston's history. That changed in 1957, when construction workers renovating an abandoned townhouse in Charleston, South Carolina, discovered a hidden room containing preserved personal effects, including journals, correspondence, and newspaper clippings related to the Boston murders. The materials belonged to a man known locally as Professor Edwin Montague, who had operated a small private college for adult students from 1874 until his death in 1886. The discovery was made by carpenter Joseph Williams, who described the hidden room in an interview with the Charleston Evening Post on April 23, 1957. "We were removing a section of damaged wall on the third floor when we found that it concealed a small chamber, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. The room contained a desk, bookshelves, and several locked cabinets. What caught my attention immediately were the newspaper clippings pinned to one wall, all about some horrible murders in Boston back in the 1800s. The place had a strange feel to it, like it had been sealed up and waiting all these years. There was a portrait on the wall that gave me the creeps, a distinguished-looking gentleman with the coldest eyes I've ever seen." According to Charleston historical records, Professor Montague had been respected in the community for his extensive knowledge and refined manners, though he was noted for being reclusive and particular about his privacy. He died of what was described at the time as complications from a digestive disorder, leaving no known relatives. Photographs recovered from the hidden room, when compared with those published in Boston newspapers in 1873, confirmed that Professor Montague was, in fact, Edward Blackwood. Most disturbing were the final journals found among Blackwood's effects, which suggested that he had continued his culinary practices on a more selective and careful basis during his years in Charleston. He described developing methods to extract what he called the essence, without the need for more extensive preparation, allowing him to avoid detection while still satisfying what he termed his particular hunger. One entry from 1879, quoted in a scholarly article published in the Journal of Historical Criminology in 1962, reveals Blackwood's modified approach. "The methodologies I have developed since arriving in Charleston represent a significant advancement over my previous techniques. I find that I can now extract the essential qualities I seek through a process requiring far less physical material, which has solved the considerable practical problems of my earlier work. By focusing on specific neural tissues and certain glandular extracts processed according to the principles I have refined through extensive experimentation, I can achieve the desired incorporations with minimal risk of detection." The gentleman from the medical college who disappeared last month has contributed remarkable insights into anatomical function that I could never have achieved through mere study of texts. In 1962, forensic pathologist Dr. Elias Steinberg conducted a comprehensive review of the Blackwood case using modern investigative techniques. His findings, published in the Journal of Historical Criminology, suggested that Blackwood likely suffered from a rare metabolic disorder combined with severe psychiatric delusions. According to Dr. Steinberg's analysis, Blackwood's journals displayed a progressively deteriorating mental state masked by exceptional intelligence and social cunning. Dr. Steinberg's paper, titled Retrospective Diagnosis in Historical Criminology, The Blackwood Case, proposed that Blackwood may have suffered from a combination of porphyria, a hereditary metabolic disorder that can cause severe abdominal pain and psychiatric symptoms, and an acquired prion disease similar to Kuru, which is associated with the consumption of human neural tissue. This combination, Steinberg suggested, could have created a self-perpetuating cycle. Blackwood's initial psychiatric disturbance led him to cannibalistic practices, which then caused physiological changes that reinforced his delusions and created genuine physical symptoms that he interpreted as evidence of his evolutionary transformation. The true extent of Blackwood's crimes may never be known. Based on the journals recovered from both Boston and Charleston, authorities estimated that he may have been responsible for as many as 17 disappearances, though only 7 could be directly attributed to him with any certainty. The remains found in his Boston residence were too degraded to allow for specific identification, and many of the families of the missing never received closure. The journals discovered in Charleston suggest that Blackwood's activities became more selective during his later years. Where his Boston victims appear to have been chosen primarily for their professional skills, his Charleston targets were increasingly academic or scientific in nature: professors, researchers, and medical professionals. This shift reflects Blackwood's evolving philosophy, as articulated in a journal entry from 1882. My understanding of the incorporation process has matured significantly. It is not merely technical skill or artistic sensitivity that can be absorbed, but the very essence of intellectual capacity itself. The physicist's contribution has expanded my comprehension of natural laws in ways I could never have achieved through mere study. I now perceive relationships between phenomena that were previously invisible to me. Each incorporation brings me closer to a comprehensive understanding of all existence, a unified theory of being that transcends the fragmentary perspectives of individual consciousness. The medical aspects of Blackwood's case continue to fascinate researchers. In 1963, a team from Harvard Medical School led by Dr. Jonathan Waverly conducted a theoretical analysis of Blackwood's reported symptoms based on his journals and medical records. Their findings, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, suggested that Blackwood's condition might represent an early documented case of a prion disease, a category of progressive neurodegenerative disorders caused by abnormal folding proteins, not identified by medical science until nearly a century later. Dr. Waverly's paper notes the progression of symptoms described in Blackwood's journals, beginning with digestive disturbances and proceeding to tremors, psychiatric manifestations, and eventually periods of disorientation and paranoia, is consistent with the development of a prion disease such as Kuru. The connection to his consumption of human neural tissue is particularly significant, as we now understand this to be a vector for prion transmission. Whether Blackwood's initial psychiatric disturbance led him to practices that then caused physical disease, or whether an underlying physical condition predisposed him to his particular delusions, remains an open question, a chilling example of the complex interplay between physical and mental pathology. The psychological dimensions of Blackwood's case were further explored by criminal psychologist Dr. Marion Everett in a 1966 paper published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. Everett's analysis focused on Blackwood's construction of an elaborate philosophical framework to justify his actions. What distinguishes Blackwood from typical cases of psychiatric disturbance is not just the nature of his delusions, but the sophisticated intellectual architecture he constructed around them. His journals reveal a mind actively engaged in creating a comprehensive worldview in which his actions were not only justifiable, but necessary and even noble. He drew on evolutionary theory, anthropological accounts of tribal practices, obscure medical texts, and mystical traditions to create a syncretic philosophy that positioned him not as a criminal, but as a pioneer of human advancement. Dr. Everett's paper includes extended analysis of a particularly revealing journal entry from 1876, in which Blackwood wrote, "The common man's morality is merely a social convention designed to maintain order among the undeveloped masses. Those who transcend ordinary humanity, who push beyond the boundaries of the merely human into new territories of being, necessarily develop their own ethical frameworks appropriate to their advanced state. What appears as monstrosity to the limited perspective of conventional morality may, from a more elevated vantage point, be recognized as necessary evolution. The caterpillar, were it capable of judgment, would condemn the butterfly as a horrific transformation of its essential nature. Yet without this transformation, no ascension to a higher state would be possible." The social context that allowed Blackwood to operate undetected for so long was examined by sociologist Dr. Eleanor Washburn in her 1965 monograph, The Invisible Predator: Social Camouflage in Victorian America. Washburn argued that the rigid class structures and social conventions of the period created ideal conditions for someone like Blackwood to hide in plain sight. The very qualities that made Blackwood suspicious to modern eyes, his reclusiveness, his insistence on privacy, his careful management of his public persona, were considered virtues in a Victorian gentleman, Washburn wrote. Social norms of the time dictated that one did not inquire too deeply into the private affairs of one's peers, particularly those of apparent good breeding. This social reticence created a perfect blind spot in which Blackwood's activities could remain concealed. Dr. Respectable. Washburn's analysis highlights how Blackwood skillfully exploited Victorian social boundaries. By carefully maintaining his public persona as an investor, amateur scientist, and cultured European émigré, Blackwood established a social position that actively discouraged scrutiny. His wealth and apparent breeding placed him in a class where personal eccentricities were tolerated and even expected, while his status as a foreigner provided a convenient explanation for any behaviors that might have seemed unusual by local standards. Most importantly, the strong separation between public and private spheres in Victorian society created a cultural environment where his insistence on solitude and privacy raised no significant concerns among his peers. The case might have remained a historical curiosity were it not for a series of events in the early 1960s that brought it back into public consciousness. In 1962, during renovations of the Charleston building that had once housed Blackwood's college, workers discovered a previously unknown sub-basement area that contained what appeared to be a private laboratory, complete with specialized equipment similar to that found in his Boston residence nearly a century earlier. This discovery prompted renewed media interest in the case, including a feature article in Life magazine titled "The Gentleman Ghoul, America's Forgotten Monster." The sub-basement laboratory, described in a report prepared by the Charleston Historical Society in 1962, contained equipment that had been carefully preserved despite the passage of nearly 80 years. The room, approximately 15 by 20 feet in dimension, had been sealed behind a false wall and appears to have remained undisturbed since Blackwood's death in 1886. Most significant is the discovery of a journal detailing experimental procedures performed between 1874 and 1886, including methodologies for the extraction and preservation of what Blackwood termed essential neural compounds. The journal contains references to at least 5 individuals who are documented to have disappeared from the Charleston area during this period, though their names are recorded only as initials. Public fascination with the case was further intensified in 1963, When novelist Truman Capote mentioned Blackwood in an interview about his work on In Cold Blood, citing him as perhaps the most intellectually sophisticated murderer in American history. Capote reportedly considered writing a book about Blackwood before focusing on the Clutter family murders instead, but his comments sparked a new wave of popular articles and television documentaries about the long-forgotten case. The contents include a modified surgical table with custom restraints, an extensive collection of specialized cutting and extraction tools, a small but sophisticated chemical laboratory, and several preservative containers of unusual design. This renewed attention led to the discovery of previously overlooked materials in various archives and private collections. In 1964, a retired librarian in Providence, Rhode Island, came forward with a collection of letters written by Edward Blackwood to her grandfather, a medical book dealer, between 1871 and 1873. The correspondence revealed Blackwood's persistent interest in obscure medical texts dealing with cannibalistic practices in various cultures and the potential physiological effects of consuming human tissue. One particularly revealing letter, dated January 1873, requested information about any treatises, however obscure, dealing with the Andean belief that consuming the heart of a worthy adversary imparts their courage to the consumer. Blackwood noted that he was pursuing a line of private research into the biological basis of such beliefs, and was willing to pay handsomely for relevant texts. The connections between Blackwood and the medical establishment of his time became a subject of particular interest to researchers in the mid-1960s. Dr. Harold Winters, curator of the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School, conducted an extensive review of acquisition records from the period and discovered that Blackwood had attended several public lectures on comparative anatomy in 1871-1872. More disturbingly, financial records indicated that Blackwood had made substantial donations to the medical school, apparently in exchange for access to restricted collections of anatomical specimens. These connections raised uncomfortable questions about the potential complicity of respected institutions in enabling Blackwood's research. In a controversial paper presented at the American Historical Association's annual meeting in 1967, historian Dr. Margaret Collins argued that the boundary between legitimate scientific inquiry and deviant obsession was considerably more permeable in the Victorian era than we might wish to acknowledge. Blackwood's activities, while extreme, existed on a continuum with accepted practices of the period, including the collection and study of human remains without clear ethical guidelines or consent. Dr. Collins' paper, later published in the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, explored the broader context of medical practice in the late 19th century. The period in which Blackwood operated was characterized by significant ethical ambiguity regarding the acquisition and use of human remains for scientific purposes. Body snatching for anatomical study was a common practice, and the boundaries between legitimate research and sensationalistic display were often blurred. Medical museums routinely exhibited specimens with minimal consideration for the dignity or consent of the deceased or their families. In this context, Blackwood's activities, while uniquely disturbing in their purpose, were not as far removed from mainstream scientific practice as we might wish to believe. The final chapter of the Blackwood saga might have been written in 1966 when an elderly woman in Birmingham, Alabama, contacted authorities regarding a collection of personal effects she had inherited from her late uncle, who had been a private collector of historical curiosities. Among these items was a small leather-bound volume that appeared to be Edward Blackwood's final journal, covering the period from his escape from Boston until approximately 2 months before his death in Charleston in 1886. The authentication of this document, conducted by experts from the Smithsonian Institution, confirmed it as genuine based on handwriting analysis and material dating. The contents of this journal, which has never been published in full due to its disturbing nature, reportedly documents Blackwood's continued activities during his years in Charleston, though on a more limited scale than during his Boston period. According to scholars who have examined the document, the final entries suggest that Blackwood had begun to experience severe physical decline, with symptoms including tremors, partial paralysis, and periods of disorientation, consistent with advanced stages of the conditions hypothesized by Dr. Waverly. His writing becomes increasingly philosophical, focusing less on specific activities and more on his legacy and what he believed he had accomplished. In what may be the final entry, dated approximately 1 month before his death, Blackwood wrote, "I have transcended the limitations of singular existence. I have become a composite being containing multitudes. What dies with this failing body is merely the vessel. The essence of what I have created continues, dispersed perhaps, but undying. I have tasted immortality, one precious morsel at a time." Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Blackwood case is the question of his potential legacy beyond his own lifetime. Historical researcher Dr. James Pennington, in a controversial paper published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1968, documented what he believed to be evidence of a small but persistent cult that formed around Blackwood's philosophy in the decades following his death. Pennington's research, based on police reports, newspaper accounts, and private correspondence, suggests that certain individuals, primarily in Charleston, New Orleans, and later Boston, attempted to replicate Blackwood's practices on a limited scale between 1890 and 1920. The perpetrators, when identified, were typically educated individuals with connections to medical or scientific institutions, precisely the demographic that would have had access to the limited information available about Blackwood's actual practices, rather than the sensationalized accounts published in popular media. Most disturbing was Pennington's discovery of a privately printed pamphlet titled The Transcendence Protocol, circulated among certain intellectual circles in New England around 1910, which contained passages clearly derived from Blackwood's journals, but presented as a philosophical treatise rather than a criminal confession. The pamphlet, of which only 3 copies are known to exist, frames Blackwood's practices as a form of evolutionary acceleration and presents detailed theoretical justifications for what it euphemistically terms corporeal incorporation. The case of Edward Montgomery Blackwood remains unique in the annals of American criminal history, not merely for the nature of his crimes, but for the detailed documentation he left behind, providing unprecedented insight into the mind of a killer who viewed his actions not as transgressions, but as transcendence. While there is no evidence of an organized group or formal structure, Pennington wrote, these isolated incidents share distinctive characteristics that suggest familiarity with Blackwood's specific methodologies and philosophical framework. His story continues to fascinate historians, criminologists, and psychologists, offering a disturbing glimpse into the darkest possibilities of human nature concealed behind a veneer of Victorian respectability. The architectural legacy of the Blackwood case persists in subtle ways throughout Boston. The park that now stands on the site of his former residence on Mount Vernon Street bears no official marker acknowledging its dark history, but local tour guides sometimes include it in specialized dark history walking tours of the city. According to urban folklore documented by researchers at Boston University, the soil in certain areas of the park remains unusually resistant to cultivation, with plants withering inexplicably despite ideal growing conditions. More substantively, architectural historian Dr. Eliza Montgomery noted in her 2014 book, Shadows in Stone: Architectural Responses to Historical Trauma, that several homes in the vicinity of Blackwood's former residence implemented significant modifications in the years following the revelations. City building permits from 1873-1875 show an unusual number of applications for the installation of additional locks, reinforced doors, and, in some cases, elaborate alarm systems in homes on Mount Vernon Street and adjacent areas of Beacon Hill. The architectural response to the Blackwood case represents a physical manifestation of psychological trauma, Montgomery wrote. These modifications to domestic spaces reflect not just practical security concerns, but a fundamental shift in how these residents perceive the relationship between public and private space, between the visible facade of respectability and the potential horrors that might lurk behind closed doors. The psychological impact of the Blackwood case on Boston society has been analyzed by several historians and sociologists. Dr. Caroline Harrington, in her 1969 paper Collective Trauma and Social Memory in Victorian Boston, argued that the case represented a profound challenge to the city's self-image and social cohesion. Beacon Hill in the 1870s represented the pinnacle of Boston's conception of itself as a center of culture, refinement, and moral authority. Blackwood's activities, conducted from within this symbolic heart of Boston society, struck at the very foundations of this self-image. The revelation that such monstrous activities could occur within the most respected precinct of the city forced a painful reconsideration of assumptions about the relationship between social status, moral character, and the nature of evil itself. The influence of Darwinian evolutionary theory on Blackwood's thinking is evident throughout his writings. Having attended scientific lectures at the Royal Society in London before his departure for America, Blackwood had developed a distorted interpretation of natural selection that he applied to his own activities. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an agent of evolution, accelerating a process that would otherwise take generations. In 1965, historian William Gardner made a compelling connection between Blackwood's philosophy and the colonial experiences that shaped Victorian England. In his monograph Imperial Appetites, Colonial Influence on Domestic Crime in Victorian Society, Gardner argued that Blackwood's practices mirrored the exploitative relationship between imperial powers and colonized peoples, suggesting that his time in various British colonies before arriving in London had warped his perception of human relationships and moral boundaries. According to ship manifests discovered in the archives of the East India Company, Blackwood had spent nearly a decade in India and Southeast Asia before returning to London in 1868. During this period, he apparently became fascinated with certain tribal practices that involved ritual consumption of enemies to acquire their strength or courage. What began as anthropological curiosity appears to have evolved into a personal obsession, particularly after Blackwood suffered a near-fatal illness in Burma that left him physically debilitated for several months. A letter discovered among his Charleston papers addressed to a doctor. William Gresham, in London but never sent, offers some insight into this transformative period. During my convalescence in Rangoon, when the European doctors had given me up for lost, I was attended by a local practitioner who administered treatments unlike any I had previously encountered. The fever broke, and with it, something else broke within me, some barrier between what I had been and what I might become. I returned to England not merely recovered, but transformed, with appetites and perceptions that separated me irrevocably from the man I had been. The case has had a lasting impact on American popular culture as well. Literary scholars have identified elements of the Blackwood case in several works of fiction published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though often with the more disturbing details modified or obscured. Edith Wharton's short story The Eyes, 1910, featuring a cultured gentleman whose refined exterior masks a monstrous nature, is believed to have been partly inspired by the Blackwood case, which Wharton would have heard discussed during her Boston childhood. More directly, the character of Dr. Augustus Bedloe in Edgar Allan Poe's A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, 1844, bears striking similarities to Blackwood, though the story predates the actual case by decades, an eerie literary prefiguring that has been noted by several scholars. In the 20th century, elements of the Blackwood case can be detected in various fictional characters, from Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter to Patrick Bateman in Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, cultured, intelligent predators whose social refinement conceals monstrous appetites. And what of the park that now stands on the site of Blackwood's Boston home? On summer evenings, when the air is still and heavy with humidity, some visitors report a faint, unpleasant odor that seems to rise from the ground in certain areas. Groundskeepers note that particular sections remain resistant to cultivation, with plants withering inexplicably despite ideal growing conditions. These phenomena have rational explanations, no doubt: poor drainage, perhaps, or contamination from the old foundations that lie beneath. Yet even the most skeptical visitor, armed with knowledge of what once occurred on that ground, might feel a momentary chill when passing through at dusk. For the earth holds memories of its own, and some stains seep too deeply to ever be completely washed away. The story of Edward Montgomery Blackwood, the gentleman with the deadly appetite, reminds us that the most profound horrors often lurk not in shadowy forests or abandoned buildings, but behind the pleasant smile and refined manner of the gentleman next door. In the years since the rediscovery of the Blackwood case, the site has become something of a macabre landmark for those with an interest in historical crimes. Though no official marker acknowledges the park's dark history, the city of Boston has consistently refused requests to install any memorial or informational plaque. Knowledgeable visitors sometimes leave small tokens: a single glove, a butcher's hook, or most commonly, a place setting of fine silverware arranged neatly on one of the park benches. These unofficial commemorations are invariably removed by park staff, but they continue to appear with unsettling regularity. Perhaps it is fitting that no official recognition marks the site. Blackwood himself was meticulous about erasing evidence, about maintaining appearances, about keeping his true nature hidden behind closed doors. The absence of acknowledgment mirrors his own strategy of concealment, allowing his story to fade once again into the shadows of history, remembered only by those who deliberately seek it out, who look beneath the manicured surface of the present to the blood-soaked soil below. As we conclude this account of one of America's most disturbing historical crimes, perhaps we would do well to remember the words of Officer Patrick Donnelly, the policeman who first discovered the horrors in Blackwood's basement. In his personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1912, Donnelly wrote, "What troubles me most, even now, decades later, is not what I found in that house, but the knowledge that I had nodded politely to its owner on the street dozens of times, had thought him a credit to the neighborhood, had never once suspected what lay beneath his polished exterior." How many others like him move among us, I wonder, nodding politely as they pass? It is a question that haunts us still.